now. Well, that was nicer. That's a new feature, I guess. Okay, I'm going to introduce Grahame and just say a few words about him because this guy is probably familiar or well known to all of you. And he's been around for a while doing so much work that it's almost impossible to get it all into one meeting. But what we're going to do is we're going to allow Grahame to talk for 30 or 45 minutes, I think. And then Grahame really likes the give and take of questions and answers. And so for those of you who are wondering about what's going on in Guatemala today, what's happened in the past, that will be the time to bring it up, okay? And you can either do questions in the chat box and I will try to pick them up and ask them, or at the end when we get to the question and answer period, then if you'll raise your hand or put that little reaction thing up there with your thumb up or something, I'll try and get to you and recognize you. And if I can't see you and you're really dying to ask Grahame a question, just unmute yourself and ask the question, you know, at an appropriate time. Okay, so I'm still going to try to keep an eye on the ball here and see who's joining us and admit them, but I want to go ahead and get started here. So probably most of you are familiar with Grahame, but here's what I want to let you know, that since 1995, he's been the Director of Rights Action, and he's also a non-practicing Canadian lawyer and an adjunct professor at the University of Northern British Columbia. He has for over 10 years lived in Mexico and several other Central American countries, and he's focused really on working on human rights and environmental and development issues. Now, he lived in Mexico from 84 to 85. He worked as a supervisor in a rural orphanage. And during the summers of 1985, 86, and 87, he worked as a human rights educator and a solidarity activist in Nicaragua. From 1989 to 1993, he worked as a lawyer and activist with CODEHUCA, the Commission for the Defense of Human Rights in Central America. From 93 to 95, he continued his human rights work with EPICA, Ecumenical Program for Central America, in Guatemala and in Chiapas, Mexico. In 1995, he was a legal officer with MINUGUA, the United Nations Human Rights Mission in Guatemala. And before reviving Guatemala Partners in 1995 and creating Rights Action. So you can see he's been very active for a long time. And Grahame and I have known each other for quite a while too. As a matter of fact, Grahame helped introduce us. My church is Gates Presbyterian Church in Rochester, New York. And Grahame connected us with Pathological, Guatemala, and it's been over a 20-year mission that we've been working in Pathological, Rabinal, and Rio Negro. We take a delegation there about every other year. And thanks to Grahame, he set that up. And Grahame and I, you know, we joust back and forth and take jabs at each other and kid each other about a lot of things. But the work he does is just, I just admire him so much. I have to say that. He's a dynamo. He doesn't stop. And the issues he deals with have got to weigh you down heavily, but he just stays up there. He keeps a sense of humor, even when I'm around. And he just keeps fighting for the people that need somebody to give them a voice and to keep fighting for him. So that's my unprepared part of this speech. And I just wanted you to know that he's an outstanding individual who is just so unassuming, and he's actually kind of lovable, you know? So with that introduction, I'm going to ask everybody who's not Grahame Russell to mute yourselves, please, so we don't have any interruptions. And we'll have time to hear from you a little bit later in the presentation. So with that, Grahame, it's all yours. Thank you for accepting this talk tonight.
Thanks a lot, Tom. Very nice to see your face and a lot of familiar faces. I come to you from Toronto, and I, like many, have been quarantined or, well, based at home since COVID began. So I enjoy getting on Zoom conversations quite a bit. Thanks for setting up this event. And as Tom said, I want to whip through sort of what I can call an overview analysis or my perspective on what we're referring to as the pathological cycle of US and Canadian policies in Honduras and Guatemala. So I will be making a lot of generalizations to try and move things along. My aim is to give you a clear idea of where I come from and all this stuff. And then hopefully it enables a good Q&A and discussion period. Of note, I should point out, I am both a Canadian. I was born in Canada. I'm a Canadian and a US citizen. And when I say we, I kind of loosely refer to Canada and the US. If I want to be specific, I'll be more specific, but I'm kind of saying we for both Canada and the US. This talk and my work is focused on Guatemala and Honduras because that's where we work. But ultimately, this talk and my perspective on this is really not that it's not about Guatemala and Honduras per se. There are many countries around the world in similar situations to Guatemala and Honduras. Most of them are in the global south, and this is a part of the bigger issue that I'm addressing today. And then specifically in the case of Guatemala and Honduras, this talk is actually really about Canada and the US. It's about our policies and actions, both from the government sector and the private sector, and how effectively Canada and the US are refugee-producing countries. Through our policies and actions, government and private sector, past and present, we are actually acting in a way that is helping produce the refugee crisis, the forced migrancy crisis in Central America. And I'll be aimed more specifically Guatemala and Honduras, but these comments, as I said, could refer to many countries. When I refer to policies and actions, if it's government policies and actions, this is things like military, and this specifically US militarism in the region has a long history. That's a government policy and action. Free trade agreements are policies and actions, government policies and actions. The actions of the World Bank and the IMF, these are policies and actions as well. And Canada and the United States are not the only countries that sort of have a heavy sway, heavy vote and control over the policies of the World Bank and the IMF, for example. But the US has a hugely preponderant control over IMF and World Bank policies. So those two become sort of part of our policies and actions. And then in the private sector, I refer to the actions of our companies, our banks, and our investment firms. And I'll come back to that. But that's what I mean by policies and actions, loosely defined. And the reason I harp on this thing sort of that Canada and the US, I think, should be considered refugee-producing countries for how our actions are directly and indirectly creating and benefiting from the conditions that are forcing people to flee, is because often in the media, if they address this at all, they'll refer to Guatemala and Honduras as refugee-producing countries. And that obviously is true, in part, that many people are trying to get out of those countries for reasons that I think most of us would relate to, and for reasons that most of us would flee as well. But we, in our activism and work, or a group like Rights Action, we just try to continually reframe the debate to focus in on the policies and actions of the Canadian and US government sectors and private sectors that contribute directly to the underlying problems in Guatemala and Honduras. And then we need to advocate for full accountability, legal and political accountability in Canada and US, and for serious transformation in some of our policies and actions. It remains astounding to me, not surprising, but astounding that for two countries that herald themselves as some of the leading democracies on the planet, that herald themselves in all of our international sort of propaganda work, information work, media work, that we abide by the rule of law. We have almost no mechanisms at all to hold our governments and private sectors accountable politically, militarily, for foreign military interventions and then exploitation that happens around the world, and also in ways that are very harmful to Mother Earth, to the environment. While we have strong, arguably strong political and legal accountability mechanisms operating inside our borders, and there's a lot of problems with those, there's almost zero for our international policies and actions. And that remains a huge pending challenge to many issues around the world. And part of this sort of presentation is after 35 years of working in Central America. It's not a hard and fast conclusion, but I see no end in sight to the suffering of a majority of the populations in places like Guatemala and Honduras and El Salvador, let alone other countries that I could name like Haiti, etc. There's no end in sight to their suffering, let alone their need to flee their countries and seek exile in places like Canada or the US. There's no end in sight if we, at the same time, don't transform and change Canadian and US policies, let alone World Bank and IMF, that are directly contributing to and enabling the underlying problems. And I got into this work in the 80s and 90s when there was massive forced migrancy and refugee flight. There's massive forced migrancy and refugee flight going on today. And I'm not the first person to address these issues. Years ago, Harvest of Empire was a book written by, I think it's Juan Gonzalez, the guy who works with Amy Goodman on Democracy Now, and then a documentary film was made, Harvest of Empire. He was addressing these issues. Eduardo Galeano has addressed these issues. Noam Chomsky's addressed these issues. Howard Zinn has addressed these issues. This situation goes back to long before I was born, thus my perspective on this. One comment on the notion of the international community. While I'm in my work and comments today, I'm specifically focused on Canada and the US. It is part of the international community. It's not the US and Canada alone that are the source of all ills in Central America or these countries I'm talking about. As I said, the World Bank is a player, the IMF is a player, the Inter-American Development Bank's a player. Other countries, usually strong allies of the US mainly, are players. And then a long list of multinational companies and investment firms are part of this. So it is fundamentally a global human problem. In the case of Latin America, and particularly Central America, the United States is the central actor, but this is a global human problem. How we live together on the planet, inside our nations and between rich countries and powerful countries and poor countries and dominated countries. And I think we need to always have that perspective in mind. And likewise, in the same vein that not all the ills come from Canada, US, not all the ills come from outside the region. Our partners, and we need to focus on this, and the Guatemalan and Honduran people know this very well. Their ruling elites, their political elites, their economic elites, their military and police elites are part of this system, if I can call it that, or these very, very structural problems. And that is who we are partnered with. So it's not a simplistic argument to say all ills come from outside the country or inside the country. These are local to national to global problems by definition. And the recent, massive attention over the last 3 or 4 years on just a continuing flight of forced migrants and refugees from Mexico and Central America is just one symptom of all this, one manifestation of all this. I'm not going to talk a lot about Honduras and Guatemala, though I'd be glad to answer more specific questions. But I will sort of set out what I think are some general characteristics of both countries. And these are generalizations and simplifications. And I recognize that and apologize for it, but I think these are generalizations that are sort of true. In both countries, a majority of the populations live in conditions of poverty or extreme poverty, and poverty is created historically and ongoing today through injustice. And both countries are characterized by ongoing repression from the government and the private sectors. There's been worse eras of repression, 70s and 80s and early 90s, but the repression as a systemic problem has not ended at all in either country, both from the government and then the elite economic wealthy sectors. And I include in that foreign companies that operate there, investors and bankers that operate there, use repression regularly. Into all this mess, both countries have some of the highest murder rates and violence, generalized societal violence rates in all the Americas, let alone in the world. Both countries are deeply characterized even today by racism and discrimination. Guatemala, I think, is often referred to as an apartheid-like state or an apartheid state, and I think there's a fair bit of truth in that, even through to today, significantly because well over 50% of its population is Mayan indigenous. And they have had the brunt of Guatemala's story for over 500 years. Both countries are deeply characterized by fundamentally flawed democratic systems. I harp on this point a bit because Canada and the US maintain full economic, military, and political relations with both Honduras and Guatemala, the governments that we call democratic allies. The multinational companies on their websites, when they talk about their dealings in places like Guatemala and Honduras, refer to the democratically elected governments of these countries. And in most ways that are important to what democracy should look like, these are fundamentally false statements. They're corrupted and dominated democratic systems at best. And around election time, they become extremely violent and repressive. If there's any inkling of a legitimate opposition that's going to challenge the status quo and perhaps win power, violence will be used systematically. And similar to the democratic system, both the rule of law in both countries, the administration of justice in both countries is fundamentally flawed and corrupted. And I harp on this point as well, because it's another one of the talking points of countries like Canada and the US, or our companies, when they say we're operating there and we're maintaining full relationships, economic relationships, investment relationships based on the rule of law, as if it worked. And it fundamentally does not work. And then characterizing all of the above is endemic corruption and impunity. And organized crime has, corruption is not just organized crime. Corruption is just how the democratic system is fundamentally flawed, how the rule of law is flawed or underfunded and manipulated. But on top of all that, organized crime has infiltrated most sectors of the state, the legislative branches, the executive branch, the judiciary, the police and the military. This is particularly well known in the case of Honduras now, which I think fairly enough can be referred to as a narco state. Our quote unquote democratic ally is functionally a military-backed narco state since the military coup in 2009. This is widely known, and yet not being addressed at all in terms of any political accountability or oversight in Canada or the US. So I'm going to leave sort of, these are some of the characteristics of both countries. These are generalizations, and I think they're true in certain ways, and they're also misleading in some ways. Anyone who is from Guatemala or Honduras, anyone who goes there regularly also knows there's a very vibrant civil society there. There are very honest politicians, very honest judges, very honest lawyers trying to do their best within these systems. So I just need to lay that out there. But all of these characteristics together, all these elements are the reasons for which people are fleeing year in, year out, decade in, decade out, sometimes more, sometimes less, but there's no end in sight. I'll talk very briefly about what Rights Action does. We, since '95, we basically directly fund grassroots funding, small amounts, but on a regular basis. We fund community defense struggles, and community defense struggles are human rights defense struggles, Mother Earth environmental defense struggles, and land defense, like territory and land defense struggles. And those are at the heart and center of everything we do, because anyone who lives on rich land in Honduras or Guatemala, whether it's rich to grow things or whether it's rich because it has resources that the extractive industries want, they will be forced from their lands, or they will corruption and violence will be used against them to try and get them off their lands, so that the wealthy economic interests, international or national, can access their lands for economic reasons. So we fund many community defense struggles along these lines. We fund many justice struggles, because of out of these community defense struggles, there's serious repression, serious human rights violations, there's corruption of the land titling process, etc. And courageous lawyers and grassroots groups try and file lawsuits, etc., in the Guatemalan and Honduran courts, and we will fund some of that stuff as best we can. And then we fund sort of emergency relief efforts when natural disasters occur, or when there's repression and people are just suffering from yesterday's wounds. Get them money just to deal with the wounds. But just to focus on the community defense struggles, over the years, just one group like Rights Action, we have funded community defense struggles, human rights struggles, environmental defense, land defense struggles related to the maquiladora sweatshop industry, the production of African palm and sugarcane, the construction of usually privatized hydroelectric dams, so they often have funding from the World Bank and the Inter-American Development Bank, the production of bananas and pineapples, the tourism industry, particularly predominant right now on the northern shore of Honduras. The recent phenomena in Honduras of the creation of model privatized cities and independent plots of land being carved of Honduras to create effective states within a state for the purposes of international investors. All of these elements are the international economy at work. The roots of this go back hundreds of years, but it is the international economy at work here. This is not sort of just local elites who are mean people. The landowners, whether they're national landowners or international landowners, are producing African palm, sugarcane, bananas, and pineapple for export. The minerals for export. Hydroelectric dam energy, usually they're producing energy that helps get energy to the mining industry, the other extractive industries, or other big industry. And so the whole focus on the community defense struggles is helping people try and stay on their lands who are being forced from their lands because of the functioning of the global economic order. And people are fleeing, and so people are fleeing communities where we're involved in struggle. Almost every one of the struggles we've been involved with, and we're just involved with a few of them with limited resources. People are fleeing, children and aunts and uncles are fleeing those very communities as other community members stay there and try and defend their lands. And then to put a visualization on the forced migrancy and refugee flight and the hundreds of thousands that have been fleeing in the last few years, when they flee, they literally, almost all of them literally travel by land across vast extensions of the richest lands that you can imagine. These are the lowlands. They have access to irrigation water 24/7, 365 days of years. And these are all the lands that have been through historical processes, through colonialism, post-colonialism, and then foreign companies and local wealthy landowners. They've been monopolized and taken by force and corruption, and forcing the Honduran people, the Guatemalan people, the indigenous people off the rich lands by violence and corruption. And so the people who are forced to flee are often fleeing situations of extreme repression, or perhaps they're trying to eke out a living on a very dry patch of land way up in the mountains or in the highlands or just up on the hillside where there's no access to water for irrigation. They'll only get rain 3, 4, or 5 months a year at best. So these are subsistence economy at best. They pass by unbelievable tracts of very rich land that are all producing goods that are being exported to the very same place that the people are trying to flee to. It's mind-numbingly sort of that sort of image sort of ties it all together in really sort of sad but illustrative ways. And then I think it's sort of a separate issue, but a related issue. All of this goes to a pending challenge in the wealthy countries of the North. For years, we have sort of criticized or referred to some people as economic migrants. They're economic migrants. They don't have the right to come here. And yet, through the working of the global economy in places like Honduras and Guatemala, the very functioning of the economy is political repression. The economy in the sectors that I mentioned, and not every sector is I'm making generalizations again, but in all the sectors I mentioned, they're characterized by human rights violations, severe exploitation, forced evictions if they want people off their lands, environmental harms, etc. That is how the economy is working. Those aren't like mistakes or a few mistakes that happen every now and then in an otherwise well-functioning industries. Those things are happening systematically. Thus, the functioning of the global economy is repression by definition. And so economic migrants are refugees. Now, there can be a lot more said about that logic, but I don't see how there's any way around that logic. The global economy is forcing people to flee from their lands in many countries of the world. And then we're turning them away at our doors saying, yeah, you're economic migrants. Yeah, that's not legitimate, and sending them back to awful conditions. The main part of our work the main part of Rights Action's work is the direct supporting of these community defense struggles, as I've been going on about. And the other part is education and activism and sort of accountability activism, all focused on Canada and the US, as a talk like this sort of clarifies. Just to switch gears a bit, in coming at this discussion and laying this stuff out, one way to articulate, I find useful to articulate the challenge and where we need to take sort of our language and our challenges, that increasingly folks in US and Canada, even in some mainstream circles, are aware that we really need to incorporate gender and race analysis into our media coverage, into our political considerations. There's more fear about a class analysis still in North America. We don't want to touch that one yet. But increasingly, there is discussion about incorporating race and gender perspectives into our analysis and understanding, and in certain circles to incorporate class analysis. And I agree with all that. I think we have to equally include a nation state system analysis into all of our education, activism, and solidarity work. The nation state system as it exists functions in a profoundly unjust, unequal way. I'm not reducing all of the ills of the earth and humans across the earth to the nation state system, but it is one more system that is locked in place on this planet where our global human community works. And the way it operates today is through profound inequality, and then it operates oftentimes very violently and unjustly. And that we just need to incorporate that, I believe, into our analysis and understanding of even things like the hundreds of thousands of Central Americans that are forced migrants and refugees in the last few years alone, because it is in part due to the very unjust, unequal nation state system, the operation of it, that they're forced to flee. I think and another way of saying that is, or trying to wrap things up, but perhaps to link it to some issues in Canada and the US. Both Canada and the US, just in the recent months, have been dealing with some, let alone years, are dealing with some of our own very serious legacies inside our borders related to European imperialism, colonialism, settler colonialism, and even the African slave trade, particularly in the US. And what's got a lot of attention recently in the US, besides the Black Lives Matters movement, and all of those issues of race-based violence, and is the Tulsa race massacres. Like, what stunning information is finally coming out to just talk about that story. And then in Canada, in the last few days, there's been significant attention on the scattering of graves, unmarked graves of hundreds of First Nation children who died mysteriously, were killed, were neglected, died in state-sponsored, church-sponsored residential school systems over the course of generations, right through to the 90s. And this has become a big story in Canada. And so there is never fast enough, but this stuff is slipping into the mainstream. Politicians in the dominant parties are needing to answer to this to a certain degree. The media, which has long been silent about many of these issues, is addressing these issues to a certain degree. But just to connect the dots, the race-based, these sort of legacy issues that we're dealing with inside our borders, in Canada and the US, our nation-state system grew right out of those same processes of European imperialism, colonialism, settler colonialism, and the slave trade. And I'm just connecting those dots. And we need to incorporate that into our language and understanding of even things such as refugee and forced migrancy flight from Central America. To wrap it up, there's tons of stuff being done on all this. And Rights Action is not even remotely the first group to do stuff like this or to even share this perspective. I learned all this from folks that have come before me. And as I said, these struggles, these issues and struggles predate my life and will go on long after I'm gone. But we just need to do more of all of this stuff. And for me, the main focuses of activism have long been whatever else you're doing, support community-led struggles, both in Canada and the US or in Central America. Always directly support community-led struggles. These are the folks, Canada, the US, Guatemala, Honduras, who are suffering the systemic structural harms. And they're the ones who are leading their own struggles. They're suffering the harms. They're the most impoverished usually. They're the ones leading their own struggles. So if in doubt, always support community-led struggles on whatever issue it is. And then from there, I think we really have to keep on challenging ourselves and who we work with to broaden our understanding and analysis through to having a deeper historical analysis of the roots of all this stuff through imperialism, colonialism, settler colonialism, including the legacies of the slave trade. And then we need to incorporate a very critical analysis and perspective of how the unjust nation state system operates so that we can begin to hold the powerful and wealthy accountable minimally in their own countries for military interventions across the planet, let alone economic exploitation and harm being created across the planet. All right, Tom, I think that's it for the 30 minutes or so. I'm going to leave it at that. I realize I apologize. Well, I don't apologize, but I explain again. There are a lot of generalizations I've made, and I do that to get through to this point, letting you know where I come from on these issues. But I really look forward to seeing where the questions and discussion go. And feel free to ask me to clarify or delve into issues that I did not bring up.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Graham, and we're looking forward to the Q&A, but there's two things I want to discuss. First of all, I want to give you an opportunity to tell our viewers about the book that you have coming out and some of the struggles you had getting there to get it published so that they're all aware of that. Many of them may be already aware of it. But the second thing, I'm going to speak for Dr. Arnie Matlin, who is listening in, but can't talk to us on his microphone. One of the issues that's coming up in Central America that ROCLA is concerned about and active about right now is the Renacer Act, which is making its way through the House and the Senate of the United States right now. And it's laying the groundwork to overthrow a government that's democratically elected in Nicaragua and impose harsh sanctions on it, which we know only hurts the people of the country and prevents medicine and things like that from being able to get to the people. So the Renacer Act is something that we're writing to Congress and Senate about, and the president, anybody who will listen. to put an end to this before it gets too far. And this is the thing that you're talking about. It's our foreign policy there, which is going to force more migration. Nicaraguans aren't sending as many people to this country as Honduras and Guatemala because it's our policies that work in those countries. And Nicaragua is doing very well with the health against, the fight against COVID, education for the populace, and everything else. So while we have this audience of activists and solidarities, I thought maybe I should bring that up, and maybe you could say a little bit more about that if you're familiar with it, or maybe Canada has a sister to it. I don't know.
Whatever the U.S. sort of leads and dictates for foreign policy, Latin America, Canada will follow. And I say that sadly, but I think that's fact-based. There's very few exceptions in recent decades where Canada differs in almost any way with U.S. foreign policy. And that's not just following the leader. That is because we too have vested economic political interest along with the U.S. and we are just aggressively going for them. And so propping up governments that we call democratic allies like Honduras and Guatemala, and then undermining and or attacking or weakening or doing economic sanctions against governments we don't like Nicaragua, Cuba, Venezuela, Bolivia, and Ecuador not long ago. That's just part of the same discussion, as you said, Tom. And what often happens, unfortunately, is that we get lost in sort of short-term micro minutia. Well, the government of Nicaragua isn't the most perfect government in the world, or this, that, or the other thing, or there are problems there. And those debates are valid and legit, particularly when you're inside those countries. They're not legit in many ways in places like Canada and the US when we're still not holding our own governments accountable for illegal interventionism, economic interventionism, military interventionism, going back generations and ongoing today. They're legitimate debates, but often what you get is Canadian US politicians, media pundits, even NGOs opining and giving their opinions on how good was Maduro government of Venezuela or not? How good is Daniel Ortega? He used to be good, but he's not good. And we think this is really crucial that we give very strong opinions on this. And yet not once have we ever held our own governments, in particular the US, but Canada as well, accountable for illegal regime change going back decades, if not generations in Latin America. It's astounding, sort of the double standard or hypocrisy. And it's not to take away the importance of debating the merits of governments of places like Cuba, Venezuela, Bolivia, etc. But it's just, who are we to do that when, if what I'm saying is correct, and I believe it is, the global economic order, the political order, we have our boots on the region, particularly Central America, and we stand there and exploit the region, and we prop up some very empower, enable, do business with some very brutal exploitative regimes. The real hypocrisy is sort of, and double standard is fundamentally in the US and in Canada again on issues like that. And the US, the sanctions that the US has now on Nicaragua that Canada has as well, let alone the media campaign against Nicaragua, it's just fundamentally wrong across the board without pretending that the government of Nicaragua is perfect or not. It's just wrong across the board, but there's no accountability. And that remains our challenge in the North. On Testimonio is the name of the book. I'll refer very briefly to it. And it's a book I'm co-editing with Professor Catherine Nolan from UNBC. And it's based on years of work in Guatemala, particularly Guatemala related to the global mining industry, particularly the Canadian mining industry. And for anyone who's interested in more of the details, I'll follow it up with an email to me and I'll send you some of the information we've been publishing. But the short story is that we had basically a publishing contract set up with a publishing house based out of Switzerland, Springer Publishers. And it was quite a big publishing company, and they encouraged us to do this, and they moved us along, and we double checked with them at every step of the way. And then we finally, after some delays that were all legit, we handed in our final draft, and the initial feedback from the main editor was 2 thumbs up. This is great. It'll be a great addition to our catalog. And then we started a little bit of the back and forth that always happens with publications. And my colleague, Catherine Nolan, is really good at this stuff. And she handled a lot of these discussions and adjusting biographies, bibliographies, indexes, paging, font size, all this stuff. We did it all, leaping through their hoops, and it was all good. And then it just entered into a period of 2 to 3 months of just astounding silence. And we're like, hello, anything going on over there, blah, blah, blah. And we went through a really sort of painful back and forth email process with one of their key editors, the key editor who had been encouraging the book all along, until she finally admitted to us in an email that basically, first they accused us of defamation and unsubstantiated information in the manuscript. And so we were like, oh, please share it with us. We'd love to correct it or explain. And nothing came of that. Finally, she admitted in an email that if they publish the book, they will be sued by the third party. So she put that in an email. Boom. Well, you could have said that 3 months ago and saved us a lot of stress and dysfunctional communication. So basically, they caved into some pressure from the third party, which they never named. And we made a little bit of a stink about it. And the long and the short is nothing came of it. The contract was terminated, but we have a really solid, really solid publishing house between the lines in Canada that's going to be publishing it. And it'll come out in October. And folks can reach out to me or go to our website and find out more information about it.
Okay, I posted Graham's email and the chat back, so you can check that out and send an email directly to Grahame. And I want to know who else has a question. If you could raise your hand, or if you're on your phone or you have your camera, Vic Vinky, I see has a question. After Vic's question, if anybody has a question, just unmute yourself and kind of pipe in at an appropriate time. Go ahead, Vic. Unmute yourself.
I have a question. Can you see the entire screen of faces? Because
no, I have to scroll through.
Right. Because because that you might miss you might miss some hands up because there's one main screen.
Yeah, that's why
keep scrolling.
That's why they have to pipe up and
All right, go ahead, Vic.
Hi, well, thank you for your discussion, Grahame. As a citizen of the United States, I'm looking for focus here. As you point out, Galliano and others over the centuries have pointed out the ills. I'm looking for something we can do as groups, if we can get enough people together to focus on one thing or two things or three in terms of legislation or specific grievances. I think it would be helpful.
I'd be glad to follow up specifically by email with some of the particular campaigns that are going on. But I would mention one now related to the broader issues, and that's there is an effort in the U.S. Congress or Senate or both to pass I forget the actual name, but it's the EPICA, it's Human Rights Act, and it's related to Honduras and human rights in Honduras. And I suspect it will not pass as law for all the wrong reasons. But I think it's an incredibly good effort for all the right reasons, because it's focusing attention on how the U.S. should not be providing military arms. And you'd have to read the bill itself, and other people know more about it than I do. But it's trying to force the U.S. government to suspend military aid and police aid to the regime in Honduras, which I'm not going to say that that would be a good thing to do. It would just simply be the U.S. stopping to do the wrong thing. The U.S. has been supporting, the U.S. history in Honduras goes back 200 years to always supporting fundamentally very exploitative pro-U.S. Regimes, one way or another. The very denigrating phrase "banana republic" was coined in Honduras because of the U.S. banana and fruit companies down there in the 1800s. A very sort of denigrating phrase, but that's used sort of derisively to describe an entire nation. And that's been the US partner since forever. But in recent history, the US supported and Canada supported the military coup in 2009. And Honduras has reached sort of, new levels of violence and desperation and dispossession and poverty and exploitation. And the assassination of one of the most revered and respected and honored community defenders, a land defender, human rights defender, indigenous rights defender, etc., was Berta Cáceres. So there's huge activism going on, to hopefully have some sort of justice done in your case in Honduras, which is a vastly uphill battle because the Honduran regime remains supported by the US and Canada. And that's a good focus of attention and work right there. There's another example of it. But there's also effort to have this law passed to prevent US from giving military aid to Honduras. As I said, I think it will be rejected. It won't pass as law. But getting involved in that particular struggle is good in and of itself. It's the right thing to do, but it also focuses critical attention on the complicit role of the US in supporting undemocratic, repressive, corrupt regimes. And so the educational impact is worth it in and of itself, even if it does not pass as law. Though I hope it does.
Okay, thanks, Graham. Christine Nugent, you had your hand up if you want to unmute yourself.
Yes, thanks very much. It's very nice to meet all of you. And it's really great to hear from you, Graham, and it's been a long year, and I appreciate your general approach. I think it plays well to providing education. And so how we can capture that, overall approach is important in terms of raising our citizens. The details are there, but the overall has to be put forward. And I'd like to deal with what you can do, because that's the question that came up first, is what can we do? And I'd like to be a little bit more optimistic, because the work we've been doing for the last 3 years is we've decided to be nonpartisan, first of all, politically, and secondly, to not leave the politicians alone. We're in their face all the time, and we're finding out they don't know anything at all, that they know nothing. They're elected, they belong to political parties, and you sit with them and you think they know something, but they don't. And we're finding that the pressure we're putting on by being in their face is a form of holding them to account. We haven't moved mountains, but we've gotten some places, and we sit on Zoom calls in the last year with several members of parliament, just Janet and I, right, Janet? And we educate them, and we bring them all of the information. Well, we also have a local newspaper that publishes every 2 weeks for the last 3 years, our articles, and community-based rural newspapers, if there are any out there, can do that. I would like to say one difference between Canada and the United States, and that's that we don't blockade Cuba. So holding on that thought that we have a Canadian-Cuban friendship associations all across the country, and they're very active to stop the blockade right now. But how does that happen, that you develop friendships, with countries and peoples? And so I guess my hope is that because we are, because of the pandemic and the hurricanes, we have switched from defending the political prisoners from the illegal election of 2017. Not that we're not doing that, because the court case for Edwin and Raul is in September. We went into linking with the community organizations that need food on the ground and what have you. So we find the Canadians are very receptive to doing that kind of work. So anyhow, I just wanted to share some of that, and I don't disagree with you. It's a pretty grim looking situation. I don't have a lot of faith in governments not supporting the multinational corporations, but I do have a little bit of faith in being in the face of politicians.
Thanks, Christine, and I'll just make a few comments. One is I fully agree with you on Canada's relationship with Cuba, and I'm grateful for that. In my analysis of Canada and global affairs, that is sort of our one exception to the rule of fundamentally supporting US military and economic interests around the world. But it's not to be treated lightly. It's good that Canada's maintaining full relationships with Cuba, and that we can't take them for granted either. Future governments might go in the other direction. So a comment on the talk is, I don't find, I'm the talker, like I don't find it neither optimistic nor cynical or negative how in a talk like this. This is how I understand it, and I see these things as 500 years old, to put a number on it, and they'll go on long after I'm gone, because it's the nature of where we've come from as a human community on the planet going back thousands of years, and it's the nature of where we are as this unbelievably intertwined, interconnected human community on this planet that is increasingly small. But the planet's not increasingly small. We're just increasingly using up the whole thing. And so a lot of the tensions and stuff that we're talking about, they're bound to get worse in some ways unless we continue with transformational work. And hopefully a discussion like this is just to connect some of the dots, the history to the present and the local to the global. But then I fully agree with you in terms of what can be done about it. I believe strongly in supporting legitimate each and every struggle. And hopefully from the perspective that does go from the local to the global. But if we do that, because you can't take on the whole thing, so-called, as if it was just one thing, but you take on a piece of it. And I know the work that you're all doing related to Honduras and Edwin and the political prisoners. Edwin Espinal was a political prisoner. He's a criminalized sort of community activist in Honduras, and his partner is Karen Spring, a Canadian activist who's lived in Honduras for over 10 years. She's worked with Rights Action, Honduras Solidarity Network, and then Christine and her home community in Simcoe County, north of Toronto, have been awesomely active over the last couple of years, particularly once Edwin was stuck in jail for a very brutal 18 months. And I believe fully in your activism, Christine, that and I think there should be more of it, where citizens just take on the daunting but relentless task of going after each and one of their elected senators, members of parliament, members of Congress, politely but insistently, because they work for us. And why they know so little about this international stuff becomes a complex issue. Is it willful blindness? Is it willful ignorance? Or is it actual ignorance? On one level, it doesn't matter, because as citizens, they work for us. If our democracy means anything and rule of law means anything, those elected parliamentarians and government officials, they work for us. So it is up to us to chip away and pressure them. And the way to pressure them is sort of not necessarily on the big picture. We need to address 500 years of imperialism and colonialism now, but you take one struggle, but it's the perspective on that struggle. And the perspective on something like Edwin Espinal as a political prisoner is he's not just a political prisoner of a corrupt military-backed Honduran regime. He's the political prisoner of a Canadian and US-backed corrupt military-backed regime that favors US and Canadian economic interests. Just rounding out the story a bit. you're still chipping away on one particular issue, the political prisoners, but it's broadening the perspective and understanding so that we don't allow our media and our politicians to always hide behind, oh, what can you do? Well, as Trump would say, those shithole countries. What a devastatingly accurate but negative statement. What I mean by accurate is I believe we treat countries that way around the world. I think Canada treats Haiti that way all the time. I think we treat Honduras that way all the time. We just don't say it. So Trump, everyone wagged their finger at Trump, and rightly so. But we treat countries that way, and particularly a certain sector of the population in these countries and their environment. That's how we treat them. And so, but I do believe, just to finish off, strongly in local activism that goes after local politicians, connecting the dots from the local to the global level, and being politely insistent and staying with it year after year.
Okay, does anybody else have a question for Grahame or a statement you'd like to make? Tom Casey, I see you're raising your hand. Go ahead, Tom.
Yes, thank you, Grahame, for the education. Has anybody tried to quantify very, very roughly the rate of migrations from Nicaragua relative to Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador? And could you comment briefly on why Nicaragua is a lower rate?
I'll give my 2 cents worth on that. A lot of groups, NGOs, good NGOs and solidarity groups, and non-North American media have documented the very different migrancy rates and the very different rates of violence. And those are the 2 issues I'd like to address. Just to give some examples, the forced migrancy and refugee flight, and then the levels of violence inside the countries. It's stunning the difference between Nicaragua and then Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala on those 2 fronts. Nicaragua has issues related to being a very poor country and a country that's dominated by the global economy, and there are very poor people there, and that's a complex issue. And I respect them for many of their programs going back to the early mid-'80s on how they're trying to deal with endemic systemic poverty inside an unjust global order. And there's a lot of debate about that. Is this policy the best? Can they shift and adjust it to another policy? But it's a hard battle on the best day, in the best case scenario, because it's still little Nicaragua dominated by the unjust global economy, let alone the addition of these unjust and illegal sanctions by the US and Canada and others. But to just to shine the flashlight on the violence rates, Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador have some of the highest murder rates. They have the highest murder rates in the Americas, some of the highest murder rates in the world when you look at them over the last 10, 15, 20 years. Year in, year out, extraordinary violence rates. And Nicaragua has very low violence rates. That's based on policy decisions and government action and police reform and judicial reform going back to the 80s. But it never gets recognized in the North American mainstream media because we, for reasons that have already been discussed, there's an ongoing effort to weaken, undermine, or even help overthrow that government and put back in place a government that's fully pro-US and Canada politically and economically. And then you can look at the same statistics related to forced migrancy and refugee flight. The numbers are stunningly higher in the case of El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala. It's not to say that there aren't Nicaraguans who are trying to get into the US and trying to make it work there. There are, but the numbers are just drastically different. And for a country that comes from a very similar history, certainly right through to the late 70s and early 80s with the revolutionary government of the Sandinistas, when it comes from a same history of full-on US domination, US-backed military regimes, the Somoza regime, etc. Very similar histories. From that time forward, even under constant sort of military, ideological, and economic attack led by the US, followed by Canada, they're still coming out ahead of their neighbors, El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala, that are fully supported by Canada and the US. But our media is doing deeply complicit work in not properly reporting on that issue.
Graham, we just had a chat question saying, what about Costa Rica?
Well, Costa Rica has such a different history, and I do have an answer that's made sense to me for years. I lived there from 1989 to 1993, and just to keep it short, because other people know more about this and have written more extensively about it, but there's a deep history that goes back hundreds of years through imperialism and colonialism, settler colonialism, and how that played itself out in this chunk of land that's now called Costa Rica, because these countries were created out of colonialism, they weren't always there. And then one day, through the creation, for the breaking off of the Spanish monarchy and the creation of the independent states of Central America, if you compare a country like Guatemala, where it was a racist state set up on top of a Mayan majority from the get-go, inside these now imposed borders called Guatemala, Costa Rica had quite a different history, not probably more similar to Canada's in that sense, where the percentage of indigenous people inside its borders was quite small. The racism is no less, and the exploitation of the indigenous people and the harms against them have been no less in some ways, certainly going back hundreds of years. But how it played itself out in the development of the nation was different, in part for those reasons. And then for more recent history, I think the most compelling argument was that in the late 40s, while before the so-called Cold War really took off in the US, and before McCarthyism really started to take off in the US, looking for commies under everywhere, Costa Rica had quite a significant sort of political strife and civil war in the 40s. And it was basically headed up by a centrist political party, political interest, mainstreamish, and a socialist left-wing type group. And they fought it out, and there was killing, and people were died, and then they stopped their own civil war and said, let's negotiate a solution. And the US did not intervene, and that's the key thing. So they negotiated their own solution, and the mainstream party, the middle of the road mainstream party, won the day, but they negotiated things like getting rid of the military across the board. They got rid of the military. Public education, public health systems, they established them. They were basically copying stuff from FDR in the 30s and public education systems that are being established in certain countries around the world. But the US did not intervene. That's, for me, that's the key thing. If you contrast it with what happened in Guatemala during almost the same time period, Guatemala had a middle of the road, fairly progressive government in the 40s and into the 50s. They ended up with the famous Arbenz government. This was not a left-wing government. They were not nationalizing vast tracts of land or nationalizing the economy or turning it into a public sector economy. But they were doing land reform. They were trying to franchise indigenous people to vote. They were trying to set up public education, public health. And by 1954, Cold War was full on. McCarthyism was full on. The US saw commies everywhere. And then in a partnership with the United Fruit Company, because the government of Guatemala was rightfully and legally expropriating a small percentage of the United Fruit Company lands that they weren't using to distribute to people who had no land, the US just carried out a coup there. And look at the history between Guatemala and Honduras since those two time periods. It's astounding, the difference. And it's either quite depressing or it's quite educational and illuminating. Pick one way or the other. For Costa Rica, it worked out well enough. And it's not to say that this is some sort of perfect country or society, but Costa Rica's reality contrasts significantly with, you know, the four main countries that live under the boot of the US and the international community: Nicaragua, El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala. And then, as we previously discussed, Nicaragua has been fighting hard for 30, going on 40 years now, to go in a different direction. And I say all power to them, even with all the mistakes they're making. All power to them. They're doing the right thing. Canada and the US are doing the wrong thing by working with the types of governments and economic elites in Guatemala and Honduras. And that's our challenge. That's our responsibility and our challenge in the North.
It seems like, Graham, that our policies just actually force those countries like Cuba and Nicaragua and everybody to turn to the people we're trying to keep out of this hemisphere, which is China and Russia. And they got to go somewhere to get some help. And our policy seems to be contrary to what we say they're in place for. If you have a question, anybody has a question, that was just an editorial thing I did.
Yeah, but I'll editorialize on your edit. They're not, quote unquote, turning to China and Russia or China and the Soviet Union in the past. They're turning inwards to bring about serious political, economic, land reform, et cetera, inside their borders, to bring about educational reform, public health reform, and to experiment with a mixed economies between private sector, cooperatives, public sector, et cetera. This is them turning to themselves, saying, we know how to run our country, and even though we're poor and dominated, we need to do it our way. And yes, they will open up business and political relationships with other countries that would do it on terms that are beneficial to them. And so my editorializing on your editorial is that it's not correct to say they're turning to China and the Soviet Union or Russia. They're turning to themselves and their own, trying to empower and enable their own people. And they will establish in this intertwined, interconnected global community on their own terms. They will deal with anyone that wants to deal with them in respectful ways. And,
well, thank you, Graham. That's exactly what I was saying, but you say it so much more eloquently than I do. Listen, if you have a question, anybody, and you don't have your camera on, I can't see you. I see Terry Bisson is looking. And if you don't have your video on, just there's a place in the bottom, just to the right of center, it says reactions. You can click on that and you can get a hand that goes up. And I'll see that and then I'll call on you. But for now, let's hear from Terry Bisson up there in Buffalo. Go ahead, Terry.
Okay, wow, it was a very good analysis that you gave, long-term analysis. And one thing, in terms of what we can do, of course, what struck me as you analyzed was that, of course, the troubles that are happening in our neighboring countries in the Western Hemisphere are also troubles that are happening within the United States and Canada. And you referred to that. And if you make a list of like political corruption, I happen to know is a problem that we face in the United States, and disenfranchisement of voters is something that we see, and multinationals displacing people and not exactly taking their land away from subsistence farming, but ruining their communities from the outside forces of the company. So, it seems like maybe the United States would benefit from everything that we learn about Guatemala. We should be saying, we should also be looking for how they resist, how they struggle, and saying, getting people in the United States who are resisting and struggling to speak out in solidarity, so that, in other words, although the United States says, well, we're so great that everyone wants to come here, and that's the problem, that the other countries aren't so great, we're great. Instead, it's a matter of solidarity. We're all in this together, and somehow we have to, we could learn a lot from the severe commitment to struggles that are taking place in our neighbors. And we should be encouraging those struggles, of course, just like we should be encouraging the struggles here in the United States. So that's sort of my meditation on what you said.
Oh, I agree. And I think many of us know, or probably some folks listening are directly involved with some of the very moving and powerful grassroots struggles going on across the US and Canada now. They're dealing First Nations issues in Canada, Black Lives Matters issues in the US, American Indian movements in the US. Some of these grassroots, and there's more, but these grassroots struggles, land defense struggles, race-based struggles focusing on racism, etc. These are powerful struggles. The conditions are not identical to the conditions in Guatemala and Honduras, for example, but the nature of the struggles and why they're struggling, there's a lot of similarities. And I don't think any one struggle ultimately takes precedent over another in terms of importance or where one dedicates their time. I just, in the work I've been involved with and thus this presentation, is recognizing and honoring and trying to support different struggles in different places, is trying to connect the dots and see the interconnections, profound interconnections from the local to the global, the past to the present, and that we are all in this together as human beings on this planet, trying to coexist, hopefully one day in a healthy, planet-friendly way, in a way that is friendly and respectful of Mother Earth and all the other life forms. And we're dealing with deep, more in some countries, less in others, but deep structures, systemic and structures inherited from the past that cut down on very harsh lines related to race, gender, class. And then I'm throwing into the mix this nation state system. These are part of the obstacles. And I'll leave it at that.
Okay, I'm seeing Michael Chapman raising his hand. Michael, unmute yourself and the floor is yours.
You haven't found the unmute button yet, Michael.
Here we go. Does that work?
Yes.
There you go.
Graham, hello, Graham. Hello, everyone. Analysis is very helpful, as always. I always learn more every time we have conversations. You referred earlier to Honduras, the Northeast coast, the issue of tourism and state within states. I wonder if you could talk more about that, because I think that's an example of another example of what you're talking about, but I think it gives a smaller localized picture to that.
It is a very good example of the discussion, and I'll talk about the Garifuna indigenous people, and then their land defense struggles related to the production of African palm, related to the global tourism industry, and then this newer phenomena in Central America of creating these city-states, these independently functioning city-states, which are super complicated at best, and they're being implemented through corruption and violence. But I'd connect the dots back to the previous comment and discussion about these are struggles that are similar in many ways, and increasingly so, to struggles going on in Canada and the US. And I think it behooves us to understand them as similar, even when we need to recognize the difference when they're playing themselves out between rich countries and poor. It's not like it's a separate thing altogether. It's just an added level of complication when it's a rich country on top of a poor country, an exploiter country on top of an exploited country. But the lived phenomena of the people who are under attack, their lands are under attack by wealthy economic, political interests. There's a lot of similarities with how the lived reality of people who are suffering the harms, or the local environment that is being harmed. On the North Shore of Honduras, to try and make this brief, Rights Action has worked with an organization called OFRANE since 1998, and this is OFRANE is the leading organization there that represents the rights and land defense interests of the Garifuna people, and an amazing indigenous people whose roots go back through escaped slaves and hundreds of years of European imperialism and colonialism in the Caribbean islands. And escaped slaves intermingling and intermarrying with some of the original indigenous people of the Caribbean islands, and then becoming, other people have written a lot more about this and know it better, but becoming the Garifuna people as they're now known. And they were forcibly settled by European powers. I think it was Britain or it was Spain, perhaps. They were going to be decimated on an island, or they were invited to be forcibly evicted from the Caribbean islands to the North Shore of Honduras. Honduras wasn't a country at that time. And they settled there. And over the next hundreds of years, 200 and plus years, the Griffin people this is their land and territory all along the North Shore of Honduras, down into Nicaragua, and even into Costa Rica a bit, up into Guatemala, and even into Belize a bit. But the majority population lives in Honduras. They speak their own language. They remain today matriarchal societies, and it's been seriously educational and an honor to be able to support them in the small ways that Rights Action supports them all these years. They are under attack in a very racist country by global tourism interests and the production of African palm by globally funded and World Bank invested African palm industry, and by these new phenomena of these privatized city-states. And these are the brainchilds of wealthy capitalists and libertarians in basically the wealthy countries, and they're negotiating contracts and deals with this corrupt U.S. and Canadian-backed government of Honduras to literally carve out chunks of land. And not surprisingly, it's the good land. It's the waterfront land. It's the beach land. It's the rich land. It's where there's going to be ports. There's going to be cruise ship businesses. They're just picking and choosing. Oh, it'd be nice to own that piece of land over there. Oh, it's Honduras. Oh, there's indigenous people there. Oh, let's talk to the government. And then they carve it out. And then the interest with these so-called model cities is then to have their own constitution, have their own police forces, have their own judiciary in these huge swaths of land that are cut out of Honduras. And then basically they will form their own governments, sort of corporately elected governments, and it'll be run by the investors. And depending on what the particular land is, usually a coastal, there'll be tourism industry, there'll be maquiladora sweatshop industries, and then there'll be cruise ship and port industry. And they're just carving it away. So that battle's going on right now in Honduras, during the reign of this terrible government that's been in power since the 2009 military coup. But it is another example of why the US and Canada backed that coup, because that government of Honduras, military-backed government of Honduras, favors global capital, global investors, dominated mainly by the US and Canada, but also investors from around the world. And the ones who are paying the price are the majority population of Honduras.
Well, Graham, I'm afraid we're going to be running out of time here, so we're going to wrap it up. I give you my undying gratitude for being able to come tonight and speak to us all. I see Catherine Nolan is on the call. I'm looking forward to meeting her sometime in person. I've met one of her students in Rio Negro, Jesse, I think, who wrote a book about Rio Negro and the dams and how it's hurt the indigenous people. And so I look forward to meeting all of you actually in person sometime. But Graham, you're always interesting to talk to. I love talking with you. I enjoy it more over a tall stout at Rohrback's, which hopefully sometime Canadian border will open up again and we'll get together.
Alrighty.
But thank you to everyone who joined us tonight. We really appreciate it. The program was recorded. Give me a few days. We'll try to upload it to ROCLA.org, our website for the Registered Committee on Latin America. And also we have a YouTube channel and it'll be uploaded onto that as well. I've put my address in the chat box. If you wanted to email me directly, I'll try to send you a copy of it. And also I put Grahame Russell's email in the chat box. It's info@rightsaction.org. And so feel free to write to Graham if you'd like to talk with him further about any of these subjects. He has an immense amount of knowledge, and it's always a joy to have him with us. And it's always a joy to have all of you with us and to be working with LASK up there in Buffalo. So we've got people from all over tonight. I don't know if we had anybody actually from Guatemala, but I suspect we've had some people from Central America joining us tonight. And what a great blessing it is to have Zoom to be able to do that. We sacrifice the personal contact, but we get to expand our contacts and get to meet more people and get more knowledge this way. So thank you all very much for coming. Graham,
Thank you very much.
Later.
Nice to see so many friendly faces. We'll all be in touch.
Okay.
Thanks, Tom.
Good night, everybody. Thanks.
Good night.
I'm
Be
gonna
well,
end.
everybody. Be well.
Okay.
Thank you, Graham.
Thank you.
Well, here we are. Okay.
Oh, Michael R. living in Buffalo. He's from Guatemala.
Yeah. So he asked about the YouTube channel. How easy is it to find your YouTube channel?
You know, I've always had a little bit of trouble because there seem to be two channels. But it should be just go onto YouTube and click and search Rochester Committee on Latin America. And there might be two channels that comes up. But just check it out. You'll know which one is a legitimate one. I think I created one by accident one time. There's a couple of things on there, but there's a lot more things on a regular channel, Michael. So mucho gusto, Michael. Nice to meet you.
Mucho gusto, gracias.
De nada. Janet, I know your daughter Karen. She's a sweetheart. She's the best. So it's nice to meet you in person. I hope.
Very much. Thank you very
you're
much.
well down.
Karen speaks very highly of your group as well, and
Thank
greetings from Simcoe County, Ontario, Canada. And
Appreciate it.
we really appreciate your work because it is exactly around the same grains as your group. We did start in 2018 when Edwin Espinel, my son-in-law, was arrested in the post-electoral crisis of 2017, but we continue to support the Honduran people as well as Edwin and other political prisoners' upcoming trials. So we appreciate your work as well.
Yeah, I was going to ask you what Edwin's current situation was. I know they've been in limbo with his trial pending, so nothing yet.
Well, his trial is pending for September 13th and 14th. It will be it has been postponed twice. We're hoping that it will go forward. We are very concerned, however, because of the corruption in the government, and of course that goes right into the judicial system. But Edwin has had some really serious struggles with due to speaking out against the Hernandez regime, as well as Raul Alvarez, who was incarcerated with Edwin for the same thing, and Romel Herrera, who hopefully will be getting out of prison today or tomorrow. He was arrested on May the 31st, 2 years ago. So he's a political prisoner as well for speaking out and raising your voice against corruption and all of the nonsense that's going on in Honduras. It really marginalizes the people. So
What can we do here in Rochester? Put pressure on somebody who
well,
listen to us there, the president in Honduras.
well, letters to the Honduran government, speaking to your Congress members, that would help. Of course, as you know, Karen is involved in her work with the Honduras Solidarity Network. She does a lot of work with U.S. senators and Congress people, but everybody's voice helps, because Edwin is kind of the token political prisoner who was really he also worked with Berta Cáceres and her committee and helped Berta a lot, and so all of the work and the struggles that he's had are related to his activism.
Well, we'll keep them all in our prayers and hope everything will go well. And we will write some letters and get them sent to anybody who will listen, or even if they won't, we'll send them. I think that was an excellent point that Christine brought up, that you just got to educate them and stay in their face and let them know that
That's
there are
right.
people that are holding them to their to the task at hand.
Yes, and I think it's the power of a small rural community. It really goes places when you just keep at your elected officials. We also have very, very excellent members of parliament in our rural community. They're very traditional in looking after their constituents, and they've gone to bat for us. And so our voice is very strong, and we don't give up. And they know that if they don't do something and they don't go forward as well, that we won't go away.
Jamie, how did you build your base? How did you build it? Through churches? Through
My when Edwin was arrested, we come from a very not militant, but we speak our mind in our rural community. We had a struggle a few years ago related to our water, and they were going to be putting in a dump that was going to ruin our water source. And so the people in our community fight for local issues like that. And so when Edwin Espinal was arrested, due to his work in social justice in Honduras, the people in our rural community came out and we had a meeting. The local church got involved, and because our community is so tightly knit, we formed this committee, and we had a lot of support from our neighbors, not only in our small rural area, but in our whole county, and our township, and then our county, and then into Toronto. And we expanded. We went to Ottawa. We met with social justice groups in Ottawa. We reached out to to BC and all over, and then into the US. And but the basis was this local feisty rural community. And some of our neighbors, we have some wonderful neighbors that said, okay, let's form a committee and let's get started. Edwin's a political prisoner and we're going to educate. And that's what we did. We had two, I mentioned one community meeting. Well, we had two. We went to Toronto and had a community meeting there. And we have a local paper that we publish in every 2 weeks, and that gets the story out. And that expands to different parts of Ontario, and we got our local radio stations, our TV stations, Toronto. We had a company that put up 2 billboards to release the political prisoners in Honduras, and people would call us and say what's going on in Honduras. And we have a WordPress and sent that out. So that's how that's how a very small local rural community can get going and get the word out and fight for a cause.
It's a lot of work that you've been doing, so that's great.
Well, we continue to do so, and we have all kinds of donations still coming in regard to our food programs that we support in El Progreso and Tegucigalpa. And so we've sponsored 2 Canadian delegations. We have wonderful support from the Public Service Alliance of Canada, from our labor councils or our teachers unions, our local churches, and individuals and businesses, and it goes on.
As Grahame Russell would say, keep on keeping on.
Oh, yes. And Graham, of course, has been right along with us.
I'm sure he is, Ben.
Oh, yes. Graham's been along with us and fighting at the gates of La Tolva prison with us to get in. So, yep. Yeah, it's been a struggle.
Well, very good. Well, keep up the good work and give my love to Karen and Edwin. Tell them I said hi.
Oh, well, thank you very much. I certainly will.
All right.
Thank
Sounds
you,
good.
thank you for this wonderful evening. This has been very educational and very heartwarming to know that there are so many people all over that are so concerned about what's happening in Central America.
Yeah. And
Yep.
who's that young person standing next to you?
Oh, this is another rural community member. This is
All
my
right.
Karina.
What's
Yeah.
your name?
This is Karina
Karina.
Spring, and she is part of our Simcoe County group, aren't you, Karina?
Fantastic.
Karina was out holding up a billboard sign, weren't you?
All right. Way to go. Way to go.
So,
Well, nice to meet you. Mucho gusto, as they say.
yeah, well, thank you very much, everyone. This has been a wonderful talk.
Well, good. Glad you could join us, and it was nice to meet you.
Take care.
All right.
Bye.
Bye. All right, everybody. I'm going to sign off. So everybody have a good evening, and we'll be talking soon, I'm sure.
Thank you.
All right. Good night.